Maybe get more ready.
Welcome, everybody. No backlight today because we got some dark topics. We're getting deep. Why? We're talking about pacing today, and we're going to get into things that you are going to think have nothing to do with pacing, probably. But if you just focus and you make it to the end, you're going to learn a lot, and you're going to have some good questions, and hopefully we'll be able to answer them in the next podcast. So yeah. I've been learning a lot lately, and I decided everyone else should be learning a lot too. So if you're a coach, you'll love it. And if you're an athlete who's interested in understanding what's going on and why things are happening, you're going to love it too. Coach Sam's going to probably take the reins on a lot of this, and I'm going to pretend I'm the audience member, and I'm going to interject with the questions that you're going to be asking. So in preparation for this, I was thinking like a cool story or cool event that has happened that would be good to kind of like use. And initially I thought mainly just because it's really cool. It was Jason Khalipa when he did the 2K into the half marathon row, and he won both of them. Not getting into what we're going to be talking about, but the idea of him being able to do that and understanding how powerful he was, and how enduring he was, and how he could recharge in that amount of time and then like turn it back on. Super cool. It would have been cool to have something hooked up to him to see that. And I really would love to know the splits for every 1K, like the first 2K and then every 1K, after that. So what is that?
Yeah.
19 more.
Yeah.
Crazy.
I love your optimism. You're definitely more optimistic about this than I am, which is good. I'm glad you can carry us forward. And I say that for the few of you who will listen to this, because this is a very dense discussion. And so my goal is to delay as long as possible any real scientific jargon. That's my goal. I'm going to try to use words and terms that even maybe my wife would understand. But for sure, anybody listening.
Where'd you get that sweatshirt?
You mean my shirt? Refuse to be out work?
Oh, yeah, it's kind of dope.
Yeah.
Shout out to Be Relentless,
Will. He does great photography. He's from Virginia. Good guy.
Nice.
So back on track.
Yeah, sorry.
So we're going to try to make this understandable, comprehensible as best as possible. And I'm going to try to not use any scientific jargon. That's my challenge, as long as possible. So
if you guys saw the private chat right now, you wouldn't believe him.
So of course the title is Why We Pace. Why do you pace? And why do you pace in the way that you do? Which is a really good thing to reflect on and think about. Like, why do I slow down at certain points when I'm performing work? Why do I speed up? Why do I hold a consistent pace on a piece of work? Why do I vary my speed? Why do some movements feel more fatiguing than others, where I have to adjust my pace to accommodate for that? Well, that's what we're going to try to uncover a little bit more, provide a little bit more clarity on today as best we can. So the way I want to kick this,
it's kind of philosophical in itself. Like, it's kind of, if you really are thinking about it, if you ask anything why something's happening, like why I'm running, why am I slowing down? Like, well, it kind of hurts. Like, why does it hurt? Like, why is that happening? Like, it just kind of keeps going. And to me, it's, a lot like, why do you believe whatever you believe in? Well, then why do you believe in that? Or why is that,
you don't want to get into
about it. It's just more complex. Yeah.
Well, you got to pick a point where you stop. So we can stop at physiology, which is what we're basing a lot of this discussion on, like what's happening physiologically as you're working. And obviously there's a psychological component that ties into this, but we're probably not going to get into that in this episode because we're going to try to be succinct and cover a good chunk to get the ball rolling. And last thing to preface with, this is more for our benefit than it is for anyone else's, because we're going to get more out of this by trying to explain this, then you guys are listening. So thanks for lending us your ears. And hopefully you'll walk away with
they
something.
could ask some good questions,
I hope,
which
yeah,
would
hopefully.
help us. But
Yep.
it's
Oh.
it's still I'm more optimistic. It's gonna help somebody out there. If I was listening to this, I'd be stoked on it. There's probably 4 dudes right now with their Garmin's on. They've had like
Nice.
6 generations of Garmin's, and they're chomping at the bits to hear about this.
Yeah. All right. Here, let's get into it. We're already 5 minutes in. Okay, so the way I want to kick this off, I thought this analogy would resonate with a lot of people because it really made sense to me, and hopefully it will for others. So I want you to think back to, if you live in an apartment now, then it works great. If you don't, I want you to think back when you did, where you go to the store, you get groceries, and of course you get them in your car, you pull into where you park at your apartment complex. Now you got to take your groceries all the way to your apartment. Maybe you had a short walk, maybe you had a long walk. Let's assume it was a long walk. And let's assume your grocery trips are pretty big, but you wanted to try to make it in one trip. So you got all these groceries. Inevitably, what happens is you probably have to stop at certain points to shake out your arms, give them a little bit of a break, and then you pick them back up and you keep going. And then eventually, of course, you get to your apartment and you get your groceries where they need to be. Now, why do you have to put them down? Why do you have to shake out your arms? Why is that? And I think the obvious answer to come to mind would be, well, they're heavy. My arms are getting tired. It's like, yes, exactly. Your arms are getting tired. It's heavy. So now my follow-up is, at what load do you think it needs to be where you could make the whole trip without stopping? Like how much less groceries do you need to where you could go from your car to your apartment without any problems? Your arms will still probably get tired and fatigued, but you don't need to put them down. And that might be, 50% of that load. Maybe it's 25% less. The point being that there's a drop in the load, which is going to make it less heavy. It's going to make it something you can carry for a longer distance. Now, the next question is, how heavy does it need to be so you can go for an hour carrying your groceries without putting them down? Like, what's the load required for that in comparison to that initial load? And it's probably a lot less. And so what I'm getting at is there's a divide, there's a tipping point between where you can do something for a few minutes before you have to stop versus you can go for an hour, hours in some circumstances. And this has a foundational aspect of thinking about pacing, because that's essentially what we're talking about is how do you pace your groceries? And a lot of it's going to depend on the load. And this ties in perfectly with CrossFit or any other fitness endeavor. I'll try to use running because running is a good, easy way of thinking about it as well. Mm-hmm. But just as a quick tie into CrossFit, just think about, if you're doing thrusters with 135 pounds versus 65 pounds, you're probably going to be able to go a lot longer unbroken with the 65 than the 135. And you can see how there's a similarity with the grocery idea. So this tipping point between where you can do something for a very long period of time versus where you can't do something for a very long period of time is a very important threshold in physiology. But we're not going to talk about it just yet. Okay, I just want to plant the seed. But there are different degrees of unsustainability where you're going to need to pace something more versus less. So if I want to run for an hour, I'm probably going to pace it more so I can keep going the entire time versus if I want to run a mile for time, I'm not going to pace it. I'm probably going to really push it. And so we want to look at that kind of continuum to better understand why there's changes in our pacing behavior with different degrees of sustainability or unsustainability, I should say. So you want to move on to our different examples.
You left out like how was there a young lady watching you, so you made the extra 10 feet to the door, like your motivation kicked in. It reminded me of the memes of talking about like young boys at church stacking as many chairs as they could or carrying as many, like to,
Yeah.
show off.
Well, hey, as funny as that is, that's actually a really great tie-in because that ties into the psychological component, potential motivation, because if you have higher potential motivation, you will give more effort, so you will be more willing to endure the difficulty of the task for longer within the confines of your physiology. So you're correct. If you are motivated, you'll hang in there a lot longer than you otherwise would. So it's actually, even though it's funny, it's actually true. So, but again, I don't want to get too all over the place. So I'm just going to try to keep this tight and in one little area. Now, what's with this slide? What were you wanting with this slide? It says
that
for
was
those
it.
listening,
Just,
it says sustainable versus unsustainable.
It's just, there's the two things. There's a dividing line. Things are either sustainable or they're unsustainable. You kind of changed our notes last minute. So
yeah, it's okay. And I think that's, if you forget everything we talk about today, I think that's a really good thing to take away is there's a binary nature with physical activity. You can either sustain something indefinitely to the point of boredom or when you just want to stop, or bearing a glycogen depletion, heat, getting too hot, etc. Versus it's unsustainable. Like you can't do it indefinitely. You're gonna stop at a certain point, which is why you have to pace. You have to pace to ensure you can keep moving while you're performing activity. So there's a real clear binary nature between it with physical activity. And I think that's a really good thing to keep in mind, because then when you go exercise, you can ask yourself, is this task sustainable? As in, can I do it indefinitely without stopping, which is key? Or would I have to stop to keep doing this for long periods of time and break it up? And if it's the latter, you have to break it up. Then now you're going to have to start thinking about your pacing strategy with, okay, well, what would be the appropriate time to break this up so I can keep working at a high rate, et cetera. So yes, this is definitely a good slide.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing it up.
That's it.
Okay. Then let's get on to the next piece. Actually, one other thing I wanted to add to drive home that the binary nature of physical activity is the difference in feeling. Let me give you an example. If I asked you to run for an hour continuously, and let's assume that you've done it, so you understand what that feels like. How does that feel compared to if I asked you to run a 5K for time, where you're trying to PR it? How are those two different in how they feel? How does your body feel? How does your breathing feel? How do your muscles feel? How does your motivation, your attention change in both the tasks? Your ability for your mind to wander or not wander. So I just want to further drive home the difference between the two and how the experience is substantially different when you're doing one or the other. And then you can, of course, take that to these other activities that you're going to do in the gym as well, because you'll see it too. You're like, oh yeah, when I'm rowing at this pace, it's like it's no big deal and it almost feels pointless. But when I get to this pace, it's like I have to focus, pay attention, and I'm breathing, and my arms, I can feel it more. And so that's, again, it's highlighting that difference in what you can actually maintain versus what you cannot. There's going to be a point where it shuts down, where you have to either reach failure or you reach a VO2 max. Oh shoot! So I went 9 minutes before I used the term. Dang. Okay, let's keep going.
14 minutes.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's true. 14 minutes.
I'm counting it. Yeah, okay. It's the you forgot like the likelihood of soiling yourself. That's really it. There's the soiling threshold. Once it's like you're 20% less. Oh,
yep.
Once you reach it, it's unsustainable.
Okay, so let's dive into different degrees of unsustainability, because there's obviously a large pool of activities that are sustainable when the intensity is low enough. But there's actually a really small band of activities that are unsustainable, but there's different degrees of unsustainability. Let me give a real simple example with running. If I asked you to sprint 100 meters, whatever that pace is, that's the pace you can go for 100 meters. More than that, you're going to slow down. If I ask you to go 400 meters, that's probably the pace you're going to maximally hold for 400. A mile, 3K, 5K, they're all unsustainable because that's the maximum pace you can go for that distance. But there's different degrees in the intensity of each of those activities. So let's color that a little bit more to give a little bit more context. What's happening? So we have on our slide different degrees of unsustainability. So we have a 5K run as one example. We have Cindy as another example of the CrossFit workout benchmark, and then we have Nate, another CrossFit Hero benchmark workout. So we're going to talk about how all three of these are different. And they're all, let's say, for all intents and purposes, around 20 minutes. Two of them, of course, are 20-minute AMRAP. Let's assume the 5K runs in 20 minutes, which is pretty fast. But we'll just say it's 20, just so there's similarity in time spent working. So in the 5K, you have a continuous workout. You're working the entire time. You don't need to stop or break. But you can't hold that pace for 30 minutes, 40, 60 minutes. Like you max out your system at the 5K mark. Like it's a time trial, which means you're going to use all that you have to perform that activity. Mm-hmm. Versus in Cindy, this is a non-continuous workout. Every time you rotate from one movement to the next, you are resting. Even if it's 2-3 seconds, you're still resting. You've ceased working. You're walking or you're moving to the next station, but you're not working the same way you are when you're running continuously for 20 minutes. And then if you have to break up the movements, then you're resting even longer. So Cindy is an example of a work-rest piece of work, as opposed to the 5K being a continuous workout. So one continuous workout. And every time you're moving between movements, you're starting to recover. So every time we stop, which is why doing absolutely nothing is the quickest way to recover, your body is instantly starting to recover the battery. Well, I wouldn't call that jargon yet, scientific jargon. Recuperating the battery of your unsustainable work that you're capable of.
So real quick, you're saying from Cindy, since I'm doing different movements, I do 5 pull-ups, and then 4 seconds later, I'm doing push-ups. Since it's a 4-second break, that's a rest period.
Yep. Okay. Exactly. And then if it's 2-3 seconds. And as a quick side note, specific to CrossFit, this is one of the key characteristics that distinguishes those that are elite from those that are not, is the window between the workouts gets smaller and smaller. So if for a normal person, it's a 4-second gap between the movements, and let's say it gets extended out to 6 seconds by the end of Cindy. For the elite, it's 3 seconds from the start to the very last minute, the entire time. Mm-hmm. And so that's one component that you're trying to get better at to become more elite in CrossFit, is you're trying to narrow the recovery window between activities within a piece of work. Yeah. Because every time you stop, you're recovering. But some people are recovering more than others, which is a whole other thing to talk about. We're not going to get into that. Yeah. So Cindy is, of course, 20 minutes of 5 pull-ups, 10 push-ups, 15 air squats. Now, how is that different than Nate? So Nate is 20 minutes of 2 ring muscle-ups, 4 handstand push-ups, 8 kettlebell swings. So Nate is also a non-continuous workout, just like Cindy. It's a work-rest interval. So you're going to work and then rest, work, rest, work, rest. However, you're going to accumulate more work in Cindy than you are Nate, because there's a complementary nature to pull-ups, push-ups, air squats. So with the pull-ups, I'm of course using my pulling musculature. Then I go to push-ups. I'm using my pressing musculature. My pulling musculature is recovering. I'm not using my legs with either of those. Then I go to air squats. Now I'm using my legs. My upper body's recovering. Then I go back to pull-ups. And this is why you're going to see people get 30 plus rounds in Cindy, or at least they did back in the day. Whereas in Nate, getting 20 rounds is really impressive, and over 20 rounds is very impressive, because the ring muscle up is, of course, fatiguing the pulling, pressing musculature. The handstand push-ups is fatiguing the pressing musculature. The kettlebell swings is fatiguing the grip. also some of the upper back, the hips a little bit, which is utilized in the other two. So you're getting this non-complementary nature with them. Yeah, getting inverted. So there's a non-complementary nature with those movements, which is going to limit your ability to keep working at a high rate because you're accumulating fatigue with each movement every time. That's very similar to each other. So you're actually going to perform arguably more work in Cindy because you can keep working at a high rate. Whereas in Nate, you're going to have to slow your work rate down to keep moving. Otherwise, you're going to run into a wall because you're going to start getting blown up. You're going to have to start breaking movements up, reps up that you otherwise shouldn't have to. So that just shows different degrees of unsustainability. Because like I said, the 5K run is not sustainable, as in you can't do that. You can't hold that pace for more than, again, 20, 23, 24 minutes, whatever your PR is. Whereas in Cindy, you are going to work at that rate, whatever you can for 20 minutes, as fast as you can to get as many reps as you can. But it's in a much different fashion because you're doing back and forth work rest intervals and you're trying to go as fast as you can while maintaining the ability to keep doing that. Because if you go too fast, you will have to slow down because you're going to start accumulating too much fatigue. And then in Nate, you have to be even more cognizant of that because if you push it too fast, you will have to slow down. It's almost akin to if you started your 5K run and you did your first 2K 10 seconds too fast, you're going to have to slow down. Otherwise you won't make it to the 5K. Like you'll either
or if
stop.
you did just like 90% effort, 200 meter, and then had to take you have to take a break before you do that next 200 until you finish 5K.
Yeah. So that would be a way to compare Cindy and Nate to the 5K and how you have to try to find the right cadence with both of those so you can keep working at a high rate for the 20 minutes, but ensuring you can maintain that as long as possible. So that's highlighting different degrees of unsustainability. So we've already covered that there's activities you can do that are sustainable. Sustainable means you can do it indefinitely for very long periods of time without stopping. So continuous work bout, that's the key. Versus activities that are unsustainable, where you cannot do them for extended periods of time without breaking or without reaching failure. And so then to add color to that, we got into those three examples as ways of kind of showing how unsustainability looks different in different disciplines.
Yeah. And I think when people see them, naturally they can see the nature of them and that you notice the difference. Like the load of it is harder as you go, the run to Nate, but they might necessarily know why, or they're not thinking of it in the way that you just posed. Like, okay, I'm doing a 5K run and let's just say I get 25 minutes or even 20 minutes to keep it even. And it's unbroken. You could say it's like one continuous bout. But when they see this and they're like, well, I got 20 minutes and I worked the whole time, like that's a continuous bout. I think that's where people are not thinking of it as like, wow, it is basically 5 seconds on, 5 seconds off, 10 seconds on, 5 seconds off, 15 seconds on, 10 seconds off. And they don't see it that way. And then I think that could open a lot of people's eyes into just training, preparing for CrossFit differently just by looking at it like that. Because when I first heard it, like it's something that you're like, well, yeah, I mean, you kind of know that, but you've never said that out loud. You've never been like, oh, this is literally just a work rest interval. So I think that was really eye opening for myself.
Yeah. Me as well. Because we have to, for those listening, in physiology and research, a continuous work bout is defined as a period of work that doesn't cease. Like it's maintained nonstop for however long the duration needs to be. So, which is why running is a great example, because if it's a 5K run for time, you are running nonstop for 5,000 meters. If you have to break, it turns into a work rest interval. It's a non-continuous work bout. And of course, in CrossFit, you're doing multiple movements with different rep patterns for different amounts of rounds, different lengths of time. It's a constant work rest scenario because none of those movements unless you're on an erg, can you maintain continuously for an hour? An hour is a good like proxy to think about. Like you can't do wall balls for an hour. You can't do kettlebell swings for an hour. You can do burpees for an hour, but you're just going to slow down and they're going to look like very like you're like a slug moving really, really slow. So you can slow the burpee down, but for all intents and purposes, you're not going to do burpees straight for an hour. So that in and of itself shows you why inside of CrossFit, you have to be mindful of pacing, whether you think about it or not, like your body's thinking about it, because you can't keep moving at this really high rate with these movements nonstop. So you have to start thinking strategically like, okay, well then if I have these 20 toes to bar I have to do, I know if I do 20 unbroken, which I can my first round, by round 3, I'm going to be doing singles and doubles. Like the fatigue is going to accumulate too much because I can't do this movement nonstop for hundreds of reps. So I need to be mindful of, okay, let's do 5s or let's do 10, 5, 5, because that's going to ensure that I'm not using too much of my finite resources with that particular movement in my hip flexion musculature and my grip. And then that way I can get to the next movement and whatever it might be, say it's wall balls, I can work. And then of course, since it's a different pattern, those muscles are recovering to some degree, more so than others, if you are more fit, more capable than those who are less. So then when you come back to the toes to bar, you're a bit more recovered. You're obviously still tired and breathing heavy, but you've recuperated some of your work capacity with that movement. And then you again go through I'm going to do 10 and 5, 5. So I hope that just provides a little bit more insight and clarity on like, well, why do I break things up the way I am versus why can I do certain things, continuously, and why I have to slow down on some things more so than others. So I'm gonna pause there. Anything you have on that?
No, good.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to be cognizant of the time because we're at 27 minutes. Do we want to?
Yeah. I think we just brushed through it, power through it. I was noticing you took out the word demarcate, and it was stressing me out. Oh no, it's still there.
I did? Okay. No, it's still in there.
Yeah,
it's good. People are learning new vocabulary. It's a good thing.
No. I think most people know what it is. It just
I don't know about that. Just put out a poll. Do you know what demarcate means?
Yeah.
Okay, so now that we've laid some sort of foundation, let's
just everyone pause, look at this for 5 seconds, and just think what I know what think of what you think it is.
Well, hold on for those listening. So we put up a graph. This is from A.V. Hill, who's like a pioneer in physiology research. And what he did is he graphed the world record times in men's skating, men's running, men's cycling, women's running, men's walking events from like 100 meters all the way out to like a marathon. And so on the y-axis, you have the speed, and then on the x-axis, you have time for the race. And you see this nice, you could say, asymptote where it starts real high, of course, with like 100 meters, 200 meters, and then it slopes down and starts to level off as you extend it out. So there's this degradation in power as time gets extended out. And so there's this great quote from Mark Burnley, who's a physiologist, researcher, who's well known in the field, and he says, "The duration that exercise can be maintained decreases as the power requirements increase," which is exactly what this graph is showing. So if the work is asking me to produce a lot of power, I'm not going to be able to maintain it that long. Like I'm going to run into a wall, whether it's I reach task failure, like I can't do it anymore, or I have to slow down, or I'll reach a VO2 max, so the maximum amount of oxygen my body can uptake to perform work at that pace. So there's, again, back to that threshold we kind of talked about. When we're north of that threshold, we're in that domain of unsustainable work where we're on the clock. We're draining a finite resource. And if we don't disengage from the task or switch to another one, we're gonna run into task failure or reach a maximum. And then if we get on the other side of that threshold, then we start being able to do things for long periods of time, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. So all that to be said, what determines the pacing behavior? Like, what determines how we approach the pacing of the activity? And the answer is the intensity of it. So if it's more intense, then we have to be real cognizant of our pacing strategy to ensure we don't blow up, or ensure we can complete the task, or make sure we fall right over the finish line with nothing left in the tank. And then as it extends out, we don't have to be necessarily as well. Actually, I should correct myself, because as you extend out and it turns into more of a sustainable task, you are cognizant of your pace, because if you're going too fast, you will run into a wall. So you're always having to be cognizant of your pacing behavior. It's just certain activities are going to make it more top of mind than others, let's say. Transitioning, the next question is, what demarcates, to use the word, which is like what separates these differing degrees of intensity? So like, what separates the 100 meters from a 1 mile race to a 5K to a 10K to a half marathon to a marathon? Like, how do we separate the different degrees of intensity that are inside of these different levels of activity? And so this is where we get intensity domains. And the best part, go ahead.
No, how do we do it, class? Like, you're supposed to ask them and they shout it back at you.
Oh, that's good. I'll make a note for next time. So, and I was going to say the most insightful piece about the intensity domains and the concept that ties into that, which is called critical power, is it's maintained across the entire animal kingdom. So they've done research in lots of different types of animals to look at how their physiology responds to exercise, and is there similarities with how humans respond to exercise. And you see in all this research that the power time relationship, which is that asymptotic curve that I talked about, holds across the animal kingdom. So anytime you perform work, your body is partaking in this power time relationship that is either going to allow you to work for really long periods of time, like running a marathon or walking for 20 days straight, or not a long time, sprinting all out for 10 seconds to try to get the animal you're trying to chase and kill for dinner. Which, as a side note, was one of our strengths from a hunter-gatherer perspective. Is we have skin, we can thermoregulate a lot better than a lot of animals. So we would usually, when it came to hunting, we're great at going long distances and we're very enduring. So we could outlast animals that would get tired who we would chase. A lot of animals have great top speed and can run way faster than Usain Bolt or Noah Lyles. I think the guy that won 100 this year.
Yeah.
So they can get away from danger, but they don't have great endurance. And so that's we are like predisposed to going long, going more of the sustainable route, which has helped us from a hunting survival perspective. It was actually really interesting. Sorry to get off topic again. There was this race. I don't know if they still do it. I think they might. I haven't looked, but it was in this book I was reading. There's this race. I think it's here in Arizona, where it's humans versus horses. The horses draw a cart with a driver, and you have to go up over this mountain and back down to the finish line. And it's I don't know, maybe it's like 30 miles or something like that. And there's a name for it. And what's interesting is you would think on paper, it was like, oh, the horses would easily win. Like they'll beat the humans, no problem. Because horses can, gallop and run faster. But but what happens is the cost of the galloping for horses is extremely expensive. They burn a lot of energy, and because they don't have skin, they have a hard time, of course, expelling the heat that is created from the energy that they're creating when they gallop, when they run fast. And they can't gallop the whole way. So they might gallop for a little bit, but then they have to even trotting is costly. So they have to go at like a really slow pace. And then what happens is, especially those that are in pretty good shape, the humans will beat them. And a lot of humans beat the horses. There's some that beat humans, but it's just funny because you think logically speaking, well, all the horses should beat the humans, but it's not the case. And so just as a quick side note to show how we have an evolutionary makeup to predispose us towards endurance and going long.
Do you know
which is called? Why? Huh?
You remember what the race? You remember what the race is called?
No, I forget. I forget what
it's called. It's called Man Against Horse Race.
Nice. What a perfect name. That's perfect. Oh, that's awesome. So I think it was in the book Exercise by Daniel Lieberman, who's a historian, anthropologist from Harvard. It's a really good book. It was really interesting. Side note, is something to read if you're interested in learning more about that. So, sorry, back to intensity domains. So we have that graph, which when you plot, 100 meters, 200 mile. Do you have that graph up, or do you have it on the next slide? Not this one. No, not that one. Did we not add in the other one? No. Oh, yeah. See, we should have put in the other graph where it goes, just because it's an easier visual. Like this is nice, but it's nice to like see.
Yeah, I mean, if you could just imagine,
yeah,
a little slide going down the.
Yeah. Okay. So, I'm trying to think about people listening. Okay, so there's three physiological landmarks that help demarcate the different degrees of intensity or the different domains of intensity. So the first one, I've made it like 38 minutes before getting into any real jargon. So I'll take that as a win. So the first one is your lactate threshold, which most people, if you've been in fitness, you've heard that before. And so pretty much what that is it's the point at which lactate begins to accumulate in the blood at a rate faster than it can be removed. So that's key, because you're producing it nonstop in the muscle all the time, but the muscle is clearing it, and it doesn't have to go into the blood. When you start to produce more than it can be cleared, it then gets into the blood, and that's when you start to see an elevation in it. So that's the first threshold. And a lot of people,
everything under that.
Everything under that is considered the moderate intensity domain, which you could also label as zone 2. So people are really familiar with zone 2 because that became like a big thing the last year and a half. And so stable lactate levels, getting into more of the nuance, that coincides with your moderate intensity domain, which is below your lactate threshold, before you see an inflection of lactate rising in the blood. It doesn't keep going up necessarily, and we'll get to that. But that's moderate intensity, mainly type 1 muscle fiber recruitment. Perception of effort is really low. Fatigue, which we won't get into in too detail today, but most of it is perceived fatigue. There's some performance fatigue, meaning if you had to do a marathon or do an ultra, there's like a lot of your brain is having to work to keep moving you along. You have to stay fueled. You have to make sure you're not getting too hot. Whereas if you're sprinting all out for a mile, a lot of that fatigue you're experiencing is performance-based. Like the muscles are fatiguing and chemical reactions are happening that are decreasing your force output at the muscle level. So that's becoming more of a limitation with respect to fatigue versus more of a psychological, a central fatigue mechanism that's playing a part at the very low power output levels in the moderate intensity domain. So that's the moderate intensity domain. Usually when you're running a marathon, you're around this domain, you're probably a little bit above it, but very long activities, you're spending time here usually. You're trying to do a lot of your running for marathon training in the moderate domain, below your lactate threshold or around it. So that's, and I'm not going to get into, I want to stay on course here. Okay,
all right,
so
the heavy
the
domain.
next, so the heavy domain. So there's a landmark that differentiates unsustainable and sustainable work. And beneath this landmark is what we call the heavy domain, what sits on top of the moderate domain. So it's above the lactate threshold. And that's called the heavy domain. And so this is, again, it's above lactate threshold. So lactate has started to rise in the blood, but it stabilizes. So it levels off. It elevates, but then it stabilizes and holds steady. Because everything below this landmark that I was just mentioning, we classify as sustainable work, because the physiology is sustainable. Your physiology will reach a sustainable point and you'll be able to maintain it, not indefinitely, but for a long period of time. So the heavy domain sits on top of the moderate. It's below what we call critical power. So critical power is the line that separates sustainable from unsustainable work. And what's super fascinating is elite marathon runners run about 95 to 97% of their critical speed pace. Critical speed is synonymous with critical power. Critical power is measuring watts, whereas critical speed is measuring meters per second. So when you're talking about running, you call it critical speed. When you're talking about like the rower or the bike, you call it critical power. They mean the same thing. It's the maximal sustainable metabolic rate you can hold. And so marathon runners, elite, like 2-hour guys, they're going 95, 97% of that. Where if they go, I posted this a few weeks ago on my Instagram. I forget, I'd have to look at what it was, but it's pretty much like if they go like 3 seconds faster per kilometer, they can't maintain that pace for more than like 400 meters. Otherwise they'll slow down. But
So
by
essentially,
going
it's like a if they're holding a 5-minute mile for 2 hours, if they went to 4.5-minute mile, if they went to a 4:28 or a 4:25,
yep, exactly.
They will literally fail before a mile ends.
Yes, exactly. But if they go 4:30, they'll go 2 hours. And so that's what you're trying to do in endurance-based disciplines is you're trying to continually raise your critical speed, your maximal sustainable metabolic rate. You're trying to make it higher and higher and higher and higher. So less of the work you can do is unsustainable. So that's the main adaptation you're going for when you're thinking about endurance-based disciplines. When you're doing more power-based disciplines, like you're a sprinter, you're actually going to you want the opposite adaptations. You want more of the work unsustainable, because that's the work that's going to power the power that you're going to want to put out. But we're not going to get into that because that's lengthy. So we have the moderate domain below your lactate threshold. You go above your lactate threshold where we're starting to see elevation of lactate in the blood, but it stabilizes. That's the heavy domain. Then at the top of the heavy domain, you have your critical power, separates unsustainable from sustainable work. And now when you pass that threshold, if you stay in that threshold, you will go to a VO2 max, you will reach task failure, you will not have stable physiology. So anything above, when you run a 10K for time, usually your 10K is right near your critical speed. So it's like right on the border. So anything shorter in distance of that, again, because running's a great way of contextualizing this. So a 5K, let's just keep it on pace with what we've been talking about. If you're running a 5K, you are above your critical speed. So you're in the severe domain, which means it's an unsustainable pace. You will reach a VO2 max when you do a 5K. You will, for all intents and purposes, empty your tank completely. So That's called the severe domain. It sits above the critical power, and all of the work inside of that domain is unsustainable. You cannot, you won't have stable physiology. Everything will go to a maximum, and you will reach a VO. Usually, you'll reach a VO2 max first. You won't reach task failure first. The next threshold is your VO2 max. So that sits at the top of the severe domain. So the severe domain above critical power, critical speed, and then you have your VO2 max, which is the maximum amount of oxygen you can uptake when, or I should say, while exercising.
Mm-hmm.
And then above that, so think about like 100-meter sprint, 200-meter sprint, you have the extreme, which is a cool name, extreme intensity domain, where you will reach task failure before you reach a VO2 max in most people. So if you do a 100-meter sprint, a 250-meter row sprint, a 400-meter sprint, in swimming, probably like a 50-meter freestyle, you'll reach, I could be off in the swimming, but you'll reach task failure before you reach a VO2 max. So that's like full effort that you can't maintain. Like you will stop. You have to stop. So those are the intensity domains, and all physical activity falls within those to varying degrees based upon, again, the intensity of the activity. So when you think about in CrossFit, you think about wall balls and muscle ups and pull ups, rope climbs, thrusters, back squat, everything. It all fits in here. And the funny thing is, in CrossFit, 95% of it is above critical power. The only things that are below that are when you are on an erg and you're going at a rate that is below your critical power, which most times when you're rowing or biking or doing the ski erg inside of the context of a workout, you will fall back to a pace that is more reflective of the heavy domain, because we're not going to get deep into it right now, because you don't want to drain that finite resource you have above your critical power, which is called your W prime. That'll be the last piece of jargon we're going to throw out there.
Just your I think it's just simple. The battery. It's so much easier.
Yeah, the battery is a really great way of thinking about it, because like a battery drains and then you have to recharge it. And what's fascinating is when you work below your critical power, your critical speed, you are recharging it. Like you have your battery for your phone plugged into the wall. But the fastest way to recharge it is you don't use your phone at all. Like you just sit there and you let your phone charge. You don't use it, which is the same as if you you just sat down, you didn't do anything. That's the quickest way to get your battery to recharge. You can act like you can use your phone while you're recharging it, but it's not going to recharge as quick. And if you and it's to varying degrees too, because if you're like, you got all these apps open, you're watching YouTube, you're doing this and that, it doesn't recharge very fast at all. Versus if you're just like, I don't know, writing a note or sending a text, it'll recharge faster. So the point in saying that, inside of workouts, if there's rowing, biking, you're probably dropping back to a pace, assuming it's long enough. If it's a sprint, 2-3 minute piece, then you're going to be in the severe domain. But if it's, 10, 15, 20 minutes, you're going to automatically drop back to that pace so you can recharge your phone, so that when you go back to the other movements that are unsustainable, you can keep working at that rate that's going to allow you to keep moving. So I think that might be a good place to stop.
I think just if people saw the distances running, it clears it up a little bit, or at least it gives you a better idea. If you're in the moderate domain, you can run for a marathon. If you're a half marathon, it's probably closer to heavy. If you're running a mile, it's in that severe domain, and the extreme would be 100 meters. If you can attach it to that, at least you have a little bit of attachment, because you know what that feels like or what it is. And I think where it gets harder to understand, but also gets clearer to understand more, is that everything we're doing is above, is in severe and extreme, as in like in CrossFit, when you're doing Cindy, although it seems like I'm working for 20 minutes and it's really not that hard until the end, you're still in the severe, or you're still in the extreme.
If you're less strong, like if you can only do 7 pull-ups unbroken strict, or well, let's say you're doing Cindy strict and you can only do 7 unbroken strict, then those pull-ups are extreme intensity activities for you. So, and the further north of critical power and critical speed you're working, the quicker you're going to drain your battery. Mm-hmm. So that's why if you're close to it, like if you're doing a 5K or 30-minute time trial of running or cycling, you can put out some serious power for a long period of time because you're close to that maximal sustainable metabolic rate, your critical power. But as you get north, or as you move north of it, so now you're doing a mile time trial, you're draining it quick, which is why you're trying to go 5 minutes all out, so you're going to use it up. And that's what's really fascinating to me as a side note, is that it's a finite resource. Like, I like using like a bank account analogy. It's like you have $100 to spend. That's it. But how quickly you can spend it is up to you. If you want to buy $100, watch, you can spend it all in one purchase. If you want to buy, 4 $25 water bottles, you can do that, and maybe you do one water bottle every other day, so you extend out the $100. Or maybe you want to buy 20 $5 pieces of gum, one every 4 or 5 days, but it's still at the end of the day $100. But how you spend it is going to influence the length at which you're going to be able to use it. So hopefully that
and that's why we pace.
And that's why we pace.
I think your Cindy analogy was good. You only have 7 strict, and you have to do 5. If you're doing strict Cindy, you have to do 5. Like that's what you have to do 1 and then drop and rest, because otherwise you've just drained the battery too much and you won't recover. Because he said the higher you're going up, the harder it is to keep the battery to keep it going. So it's kind of self-explanatory when you start to think of it. So hopefully we just we painted this picture, and now you're like, this is sick. I think it's stuck for everybody. I think everyone knows what we're talking about.
Maybe not, but that's okay. It was helpful for us.
Yes. Yeah. So everyone, this is why you pace. More on the intensity domains later. It was great. I think next week I'm gonna try and find a really good comedic reel to start with that will tie back into it. I don't know how I'm gonna do it, but I'm gonna figure it out, and it's gonna tie back to it every time. So yeah, that was great. Thank you everyone for your time. Thanks for listening. If you have questions, put them in the comments. And yeah, we'll see how this one does. It might just I think maybe it'd be good if people just got mad about it. I think people, if we start hammering down that all CrossFit is just interval work, rest, they're going to get mad.
Maybe.
We'll see. Help us stir some anger and some fear, everybody. We'd love that. See ya.